So without further ado, I would really like to thank my very esteemed friend and sister here, Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. She's a poet and writer whose work confronts assumptions about history, race, violence, and knowledge. And she's the author of the book, Seeing for Ourselves, which you have right here in front of you. I will be in discussion with her. My name is Tarek Younis. I'm reading up my own bio. I teach and write on Islamophobia, on culture, and politics, and I'm the author of this book called The Muslim State and Mind. I'm a clinical psychologist as well, so that's why there's an emphasis in psychology often in my talk, but I don't like to tell people about that. So just to maybe mention one more thing before I let maybe Suhaiymah introduce her book. I think part of the idea of what we're practicing today is that we don't have a fully scripted conversation. So you're kind of all invited to join us in a conversation between our books, but also in light of what's happening right now in Palestine and other places. And I think it's about just keeping this open dialogue. And that's where we're all welcoming you in as well. So we'll start with some brief introductions about our books so you know what our books are about before they enter into conversation with one another. And Suhaiymah, can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Hi everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Is this working? Yeah. So thank you, Tarek. I'm really excited about this conversation today. Like Tarek mentioned, I think we're quite open to seeing where and how it goes. For some context about my book, I think it's useful to talk about why I wrote it first, very briefly. One of the reasons was that prior to this, last year or the year before, I wrote a book that was quite a quick, brief, but hopefully deep analysis of Islamophobia. And it was trying to look at Islamophobia in terms of the history, internationally, how it manifests, nationally, and then at the borders. And it was trying to be kind of super comprehensive, but like I say, accessible and quick. During that process, there was one chapter of that book in particular that I really enjoyed writing, and it was a chapter where I was thinking about what the impact of Islamophobia is on Muslims as Muslim. And I felt like this was something I hadn't really had the chance to explore previously, and in particular what I was thinking about was how had Islamophobia estranged me from myself and from my own understanding of what Islam was, having learned only to see myself through these lenses of threat and other and barbarian and criminal and all the things that we know the tropes of Islamophobia include. And so this book was kind of my opportunity to dig deeper into that. And I was really excited by, and almost challenged, I think, by like what it would look like to try to look at myself for myself, and to try and like strip away some of these layers. And a big part of that for me was also revealing that secularism is part of that world system of coloniality and capitalism that we often critique and talk about in these kind of circles, but I feel like secularism remains this kind of bastion that we don't necessarily confront. And so being Muslim as a racialized identity is very comfortable to talk about in these spaces, but being Muslim as in, can I have a space to pray, can feel a lot more uncomfortable. And so there's a quote that I quote at the beginning of that chapter I mentioned in the first book, which is from Yasser Morsi, and he says something along the lines, I might be paraphrasing, of I realized that I knew the language of the war on terror better than I knew the language of the Quran. And I think that was what really struck me, and I really felt that in my bones. And so Seeing for Ourselves, this book that we're talking about today, with Tarek's book, is an attempt, I think, to try and go inside. And initially I was inspired by kind of, I do a lot of work with young people, so like poetry workshops and stuff. And one thing that I noticed very early on is that lots of young people, particularly children of color, they will write pretty quickly without direction, I am not poems. I call them I am not poems. These are poems that are along the lines of I am not a terrorist, I am not a criminal, I am not XYZ. And I found that really heartbreaking, because that's like with no prompt, that's just like write a poem. And so I became really interested in writing I am poems and kind of offering this as a balm, I guess, to those kids. But what I realized here was that there was also a limitation in that there is kind of no frame of reference for who you are on your own terms for many of us. And what I noticed is that sometimes this became quite a depoliticized endeavor, because when you're trying to do I am without referring to the context you live in, I was encouraging kids to write poems like, I am a reader of books, which is lovely, and you may well be a reader of books as your primary identity. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that you are racialized in the school that you're in, you are securitized in the context you live in. And so I found myself kind of challenged by, okay, then what, right? Like, I don't want to be in relation only to what I'm not. I don't want to be in relation to nothing at all and kind of pretend there's no context. And so I think this book was just an attempt at trying to do something that acknowledged all those things, but also allowed me to think about what my own terms might be if I was to refer to myself on my own terms. And very quickly, I guess what I found was that being seen was this horizon that I think we're often encouraged to seek, right? Like being represented truly and fully, and allowing others to see us and being seen for ourselves and not just how others see us. But I kind of got bored of this, and I felt in particular that there was actually some relief in being unseen, and that actually in Islamic tradition, going unseen, doing things unseen, believing in the unseen, were all things that offered a different type of possibility. And so I think in terms of the questions that I raise, because it's certainly not a book of answers, the questions that I raise are around how prioritizing and thinking about going unseen, or the possibilities of an epistemology, a way of knowing that relies on knowing and believing in the unseen, might provide us with different types of strategies than the ones that we see being used around us, or the ones we see being prioritized, I should say. And so, yeah, I think I'll probably leave it there for now, as I think many of these themes will come up in the conversation with Tarek. So I'll hand over to you to talk about your book a little.
Jazakallah khair. I'll just say first and foremost, I think I just forgot to also mention probably like the most important note about our space, which is the snacks and drinks in the back. So just to let you know that there's snacks and drinks in the back. We have a secret stash, but you're not allowed to know about that. So feel free, I'm fine, and just to ask with Soham, are you okay if people get up and grab? Okay, so everyone can feel free to stand up, grab something to eat and drink whenever you like. We will schedule a break in about like 30, 40 minutes. But if you feel like you want something to drink or eat right now, we're very happy with that. Also, a part of holding this space is if anyone feels like they're more comfortable standing up or standing somewhere else or even having to take a walk, this is certainly appropriate as well. Yeah, I mean, as for my book, it certainly doesn't have, I think, maybe a poetic sort of eloquence to it. I think mine was born of rage and anger, perhaps a little bit more, which I think I was trying to hold on to for a long time, and I felt like I just had to sort of let it out. So I think there's been sort of a lot of writings on the politics of psychology, so how psychology works to support state structures, for example. We know a lot about how psychology has been used in surveillance ever since the times of, colonial occupation. So we know a lot about the politics of psychology. We also know a lot about the politics of Muslims and how Muslims are racialized. I often give the example, and maybe I'll quickly give that example again, and I'll try to say it maybe in 3 sentences. After 9/11, when there was a mosque, when they recognized that there was a mosque around Ground Zero, these 2 Egyptian Coptic Christians who look like me, in case you can't imagine what an Egyptian looks like, they went to join a protest. There was a rising protest against the existence of a mosque near Ground Zero. And when they arrived, they got their asses kicked. And I think the idea of racialization, how we are racialized as Muslims, goes beyond how we identify, right? The process of racialization escapes how you identify yourself. It's situated in space and time, right? We understand, especially after 20 years of the war on terror, why someone who looks Muslim will get beat up if they go to a protest that's ostensibly the far right, right? So there's so much there that we understand about the politics of Muslims and Islamophobia. And I felt like there wasn't really any easily, I don't know if my book is really easily accessible, but there was no resource that kind of brings the politics of psychology and the politics of Muslims together. And really that was one of the things that I felt has been very lacking, and I just thought I'd try to address that gap. I think one of the bigger inspirations as well was Malcolm X, when he differentiated between the foxes and the wolves. When we think of racism and Islamophobia, often the discourse, the talk around racism and Islamophobia is about the wolves. That's what Malcolm X is talking about, is the people who are out to attack you. You know, we're talking about like, you know, white supremacists with baseball bats, things like that. Those are the wolves, and we see them because they're attacking us. But he differentiated the wolves from the foxes. And the foxes are those that lure us in with a smile until you're close enough, and then they bite you, right? And I think that's the difference between liberal racism and illiberal racism. Illiberal racism is something that everyone in society recognizes. Everybody knows that the person who's saying all Muslims are bad, all Jews are bad, all blacks are bad, we all can point at that guy and say, yeah, that guy's a racist. But liberal racism is far more nuanced. And I found that psychology is an incredibly powerful language for liberal racism. And I think one of the ways that works, maybe I'll just mention it very quickly, a point in my book, is that when we think about the war on terror and counterterrorism, we see policies growing like the prevent policy. The prevent policy, as we know, is a policy whereby people in the public, you know, you guys just, even while thinking about prevent, anyone who came here using the tube, you probably saw the poster that says, see it, say it, sorted, right? Is this idea of threat and trying to capture, identify threat, okay? So the prevent policy is trying to identify people who might become terrorists in the future. And I'm not gonna, you know, I can spoil the story here and kind of Quentin Tarantino this for you. Muslims are hyper-racialized to threat in public consciousness. So when you enact a public counterterrorism strategy, you're essentially legitimizing a full population scale racist policy against Muslims. One of the ways that the government is able to evade the charge of racism is because the prevent policy is hyper-psychologized. It says, look, don't go after Muslims. They'll say, look for people who are vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable, in your class, in the hospitals, even in nurseries. And maybe I'll just end with 2 points, and I think maybe I'll just take one example from my book, if you don't mind, yeah. There was an example, so I received a phone call from someone, they wanted me to look at a document. It was from a probation officer. And I'm gonna give the story, I read his story in one of my chapters. I'm giving him the pseudonym Khalid. He was deeply aggrieved by the suffering of Syrians. And he sent money there to support them, yeah. Through the money that he sent, he was being charged with terrorism for material support to terrorist groups. He was unaware of this, and obviously, very clearly innocent, and that's also what the judge stipulated. So the judge said this was someone who's just trying to send money to support people, dropped the terrorism charges. Even though the charges of terrorism were dropped, he had a probation officer who still flagged him as a security risk. And one of the ways they justified the fact that he should remain in a system and constantly under surveillance, and they wrote this down, was because emotionally he was very vulnerable to the distress of people in Syria, right? The love and heart that he had for others was seen as a psychological vulnerability that will put him in a security database. Okay. And this is something for us to also hold on to when we're thinking about what's happening in Gaza. So, sorry, just pausing for the... So I think there's something here that, for anyone who was with us 2 days ago, there's this suffocation, even just right now, I felt it when I'm talking, I'm feeling the suffocation of what Islamophobia really is on a very experiential level, right? And I think if we can't make sense of how people are feeling suffocated, even right now, I'm sure even in this room, in talking about Palestine, and talking about Gaza, then I'm gonna go ahead and say psychology is absolutely useless. If we can't even make sense, if we can't even hold on to what this experience of suffocation is, there's no discipline, there's no tool that's going to support us. And in fact, I think really that's why I end my book on the note, no justice, no peace. We know this. No justice, there's no peace in society, but no justice, there's also no peace of mind. If we can't first focus on systems of justice, psychology is always going to be there to try to bandage the injustice. But our first impulse should be justice itself. So I feel like I spoke for too long. I'm going to go ahead and throw the conversation back, well, I guess between both of us, right? I just wanted to maybe start off with a deep appreciation for Suhaiymah's work. But I think particularly this book, which my book doesn't do. So I want to just highlight what I really appreciate about Suhaiymah's book, is that I find your book is really, first of all, unashamedly Islamic. I find there's a very strong tendency, I can also feel it in myself, to kind of distinguish the Muslim from Islam, and thereby I can be invited at tables, equality, diversity, and inclusion, board meetings or whatever. But when I'm there, they want my Muslimness. They don't want Islam. And I found your book was really powerful for that. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting when people make that comment, because I've said, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but I think something about this book that I find quite sad is that it's the first time I feel that I've been able to do that. And this is not the first book I've written. And so I feel like there's a level of, I had to, or at least I'm assuming that internally, I've had to feel that there's a level of legitimacy that I've attained as a writer or as a speaker or whatever it is, to now be able to say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, be able to start in the name of God, for example. And I find that really painful on a personal level, but I think it speaks to, I think what's interesting, and I'm just thinking about what you said a moment ago about how, the language of feelings is kind of weaponized in all of these ways, but also how right now you're feeling suffocated, or, there are people in this space who are, and I'm thinking about what it means to even have a big public platform and still feel unable to really express what you're feeling in moments like this. And I had an incident recently which I thought it related to, I was just reading your book on the train, and yeah, I'm just finishing it. I had read the majority prior to this. I
didn't hear that.
But yeah, so in light of, a couple of months ago, I had this talk about Islamophobia planned for this month with a particular publisher, publishing house company. And I got an email really recently just saying that the event was being delayed indefinitely. And the reason was that the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Office of the company had decided that they needed to also have a talk about anti-Semitism in the same kind of time frame for reasons of equity and inclusivity. So I replied saying that this was like deeply problematic and a complete misunderstanding of racism, and it kind of pitted the idea that by talking about Islamophobia inherently that was somehow anti-Semitic, and thereby we needed to have like the other side, the other side kind of a thing, which I just said was absolutely wild. That EDI, well, it's not wild, it's very believable, but considering that EDI purports to know about racism, that was wild. And then just the other day, I got an email back from them saying that, hey, we're really sorry for the hurt that we've caused, and we'd love to have you on that same day. And I was so frustrated all day long about this because it was that language of hurt. And I was so angry that now I was hurt, but I wasn't hurt. I was like, I'm not hurt. I was never hurt. This was never about me. But there's something about how they used that language of feeling to then, like not only was it that it was a made-up story about how I felt being weaponized against me to depoliticize the very critique that I had made. And it made me feel so, like you said, suffocated, right? Like I just didn't even know how to articulate a response to this, or like whether I could even be bothered. And I guess in your book and in the themes that you talk about, like this, I'm so interested in why that language of feelings is so disempowering, why it makes one feel so, I guess just small. It makes me feel small, like you're just reduced to the feeling that you had, or the feeling we perceive you to be having. Yeah, and I just I'd just be interested to know how you would think about something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of bad feelings about it. I think it's something, I'm gonna give like an intellectual response first. It's a way of me being able to like contain my feelings. I think we know that psychology and psychologizing has a very strong depoliticizing impulse, right? When we focus on people's feelings, it's a very powerful way of, if not erasing, in a way masking the context, oh, this person is hurt. And we notice, and we were probably gonna come to it later and we can do it later, but maybe I could just flag it for now. That's been one of the main critiques of trauma, for example, and people have written how there is this discourse, this idea, this language around trauma that actually exists, in what's happening in Palestine, and saying that like, oh, Palestinians and Israelis are all traumatized. Everyone is traumatized by the conflict. But in talking about trauma, talking about what people are experiencing, it's a very powerful way of, I guess, erasing power. I think that's what it is. And I think I can kind of like hear, like, I mean, I'm also, when you said that, I was also just upset because, when they're focusing on your hurt, they're not like, oh, we're accountable. It's not like there's not like we committed some act of violence or something towards you, or we silenced you. And that's happened to me before as well. I find it interesting, and I think that speaks to also, like, I think those sort of spaces, as opposed to, and I had told you this, I was once supposed to speak about Islamophobia in a healthcare space, in a healthcare setting, and I was invited by Muslim health professionals. And I feel like in my past, I don't think I've been censored as much by anyone but like middle-class health professionals. I'm just gonna go ahead and put that out there. So anyway, I was invited by Muslim mental health or health professionals to talk about Islamophobia. That's what I do. And at the very last minute, like I swear it was like 2 minutes before I was supposed to talk. Like it was a Zoom meeting, but I'm already prepared, and I'm just like, okay, I can't drink any more coffee, then I have to go to the bathroom type of timing. So I get a call on my phone and they tell me, don't talk about policies. Don't talk about prevent. Talk about Islamophobia on the sort of very generic, getting beat up on the street type of thing, right? And I told them, well, actually, that is Islamophobia. Like, this is right now, that's what it is. Like, Islamophobia is about like censoring and managing how we can talk about our violence that's happening to us. You know, like, that's what it is. And I told them, like, if I were to do that, I'm actually just contributing to Islamophobia. That's what it is. And that's like just kind of accepting it. So I said I can't do that, and then they cut me out. Like, I just didn't speak. They just found, I don't know how they did it. I wasn't paying attention. But I think what's fascinating there is that there was no, because it came from other Muslims, there was no point of like, oh, we recognize this is hurtful for you. You know, they didn't have to, because, and I think you say that so well in your book. You have such a fantastic line. I wish actually I should have bookmarked it, but I'm going to go ahead and try to like paraphrase it, where you say that Muslims learn to police themselves before others police us, right? And it's so true. Like, I think we know all the signs of extremism and radicalization of how other people will perceive us before there's a prevent training, before there's like any counterterrorism strategy. We know how to talk about Palestine in ways that we don't have to be told by like some sort of Zionist outfit to not talk about Palestine in this way. Yeah, and maybe we can, like, how do you feel like this speaks to, yeah, I guess just this idea of sight being seen as a Muslim, right? How we self-censor in that way, but maybe also then how we express ourselves, like being legible, having to like make ourselves constantly legible.
Yeah, yeah. I think the story that you shared is really, yeah, I think there's this really specific pain as well there where it's, because if I'm just to dig back into that story for a second to answer the question you've asked, I feel like it's this different type of, and I'm using the word pain, and maybe that's not the right word, but where it's like I feel like there's almost this feeling of insider knowledge, like you know what you're doing when you're doing this. And I had at risk of making this a list of anecdotes, I remember very distinctly being invited into a school by a Muslim teacher just to perform poetry with the kids. And I think it's quite clear what my poems are about, and she wouldn't have invited me had she not seen some of them. But then in the lead up to coming in, she said that the module was about protest poetry, but could I not do anything that talks about racism or Islamophobia or anything like that? And so I was like, I don't know what I'm protesting that, you know, like what I don't understand. And she was like, no, it's more just like how can we have, you know, be together, like just you know, and I didn't feel like protest poetry.
Christmas, you're supposed to sing Christmas carols.
Yeah, exactly. But the point was, because she was a Muslim teacher, I felt really aware that she was policing me even better than her non-Muslim peers, because I've been invited many times by non-Muslim teachers and they're just like, yeah, go for it, you know, do all the... And I was really aware that, you know, actually she was the one suffering. You know, she was like policing herself so much that the risk of it being her who invited me to do these poems felt like a greater risk than anything else. And then obviously the children suffer as well, right? Then what kind of level of level of critique they're allowed to make or exposed to making is impacted. And yeah, I think it becomes, I think about this question of legibility quite a lot, because I'm interested about how being in the space of an artist or like a poet, you're allowed to make certain critiques that perhaps if I was to do them in a more academic or like less poetic form, would be deemed more like threatening or complicated. And I think that there's many things that also come with that, being a woman, being like, I think there's all these very, you know, identity elements, right? Like gender, class, how you speak, your accent, all of these things which kind of play into that. But I find it sometimes then means that you can reach this position where you feel that you're able to make a level of critique, and you feel that people are understanding and listening, and then suddenly, without like you mentioned, without a moment's notice, you kind of realize that none of what you have been saying has been heard. It's purely the fact that you were saying it, which was what mattered. And to give a concrete example, and I've maybe drawn on this many times in the past, moments where, perhaps with the school, but I think the better example is Muslim Police Officers Union inviting me to perform poetry, and it feeling like this moment that you've not heard anything that I've said, but the fact of my being Muslim, physically, like as you see me, is what matters. And so, I don't know, I feel like it raises questions around, like, you, especially as a visibly Muslim woman, I feel like you're often fighting against this pressure to excavate your experiences, right? And to say, like, this is the reason I really wear it, and like, this is how oppressed I really am, and, you know, the men in my family do or don't do X, Y, Z thing to me. And so you're trying to resist that constant pressure of being like this confessional Muslim, I think you use in your book, but then at the same time, wanting to be seen, I think, is a really genuine thing. Like, if you're against all of that, wanting to be seen for yourself, and then at the same time, you try, with all these tools and methods you may have to write for yourself, speak for yourself, say for yourself, and all of that is just reduced in a moment to, oh, you were just a speaking Muslim woman, that's all we saw. We saw that you spoke, that's well done, great, no matter what you said, it didn't matter what you said. And I find that then makes that thing of legibility so difficult, and for me, it's why I think I found relief in the unseen. Like, going unseen actually was like, oh, okay, like maybe there is a place of refuge, because being seen at moments feels like there are these benefits, and then at other moments it's just this kind of disappearing of you.
I think that's really powerful that, yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole point about that idea of being racialized, right? Like, you're kind of, again, tokenized. I think we understand how that works. And I had that feeling. It's actually, I think it's honestly one of the worst feelings in the world, where like you also have a voice, but you even know while you're speaking that it's absolutely useless. I feel like every single time I talk about like racism or Islamophobia, like in schools or NHS or anything, I always start off by saying that just to, like, I think, calm my heart a little bit, you know? It's just say, like, look, technically, as long as hostile environment, prevent policies, all these racist policies are embedded within the structures, it's actually completely irrelevant what anyone here in this room thinks, or what they hear from my voice, or what the words are, or what your ears are doing. Like, it's completely irrelevant because it belongs to the space that we're in, right? Like, what's even the point? So my words end up just being this performance, and I think that's like what you're saying, and that performance is for them, right? Like, we're doing it for them to feel better about themselves, you know? And I think, I hate that, I should say. I think I don't know why I continue to do it. I think always because I think some people, especially if I'm talking about Islamophobia, some Muslims in the audience might feel validated. Even if just for a second they feel seen, they feel heard, that I'm speaking towards something that they're experiencing, even if they will still remain suffocated. You know, if I can give them that moment's respite to know that, look, there's other people who can hear and see what you're experiencing. I think that's maybe why I do it. But you want to say?
No, I was just going to say, I think there's something really, just since we're on that note of seeing and witnessing, I feel like that also is a form of, like, sometimes when there's nothing else left, and I talk about this in my book, that maybe just witnessing one another is the only thing that we can do. And I think in some ways, you know, like how we engage with social media right now and with what's happening in Palestine, I feel like it feels sometimes like the last and only thing that we might be able to do if you're, you know, just feeling powerless or whatnot. I think is that act of witnessing feels really important. And I think there's also then sometimes, I think that's why it feels painful when some people want to disengage from the witnessing, right? And I think you will have seen, I don't know, when people are like, when it all gets too much, you know, just remember you can log out and it's all da-da-da. Because it's that idea that the very least that we can do is witness one another, right? Because if this is someone's reality, like, and you're not experiencing it, then maybe witnessing is something, but it also is something that feels so nothing sometimes. And I think in the example you just gave, I was having a conversation just the other day about like Muslims in the arts, right? And how, who are you writing for? Who is your work for? And that, and it kind of, it's this kind of a similar conclusion, I think, where it's like maybe those two hijabi women who will come to that, see that show, I'll feel like, oh, I'm glad they enjoyed it. But that's like a very, is a very strange barometer to kind of have for valuing your own work, or feeling that the meaning of the work will be conveyed only to, say, one or two people. But then again, I think that is why the unseen thing becomes a thing for me, because it's like the value is not in this world for us. The value is like with God, and that could be intentional and it could be completely misconstrued.
Yeah. I think you hit on something so powerful. If I can share also maybe a story, I think, and I wrote about this in the book Refuse to Condemn, about my mother. She passed away when I was young, but I have a very vivid memory that when I grew up in Berlin, and I explain this in a different book, and I can share, it's online, so I can share the link if anyone's interested. But I always remember the story, actually, I remember it right now. Yeah, she took me and my brother to a hospital. Germany flew in 2 Palestinian kids that were shot. And I think it was part of this humanitarian project where they flew in 2 Palestinians that were shot. This was in the early 2000s. And yeah, one kid, his leg was blown off from a bullet that actually explodes when it penetrates. And I found it incredible. First of all, my mother took us there to bear witness to this child, but he was sleeping. And she made dua. She prayed for him even though he's sleeping. And then we left, and he never knew we were there, right? And what I always found like something that's always reminded me about that point about bearing witness is that when we're bearing witness, we're not doing it, how should I say this? I'm going to be mindful of my words. We're not doing it exclusively for them. We're doing it for us, right? We're bearing witness because it's our responsibility to bear witness. We're going to be asked, at least from an Islamic perspective, what have you done when injustice is occurring? And the very motion of looking away because you don't want to attend to the injustice of someone that's being oppressed right in front of you is something that we could be asked for, right? So my mother was there because she was there for herself. She was bearing witness because she was fulfilling a responsibility for herself. Beyond, obviously, that bearing witness, I should be very clear here, is the bare minimum that we should, we're just going to put that out there. And we have that, obviously, in Islamic traditions, that if you see an injustice, you change it with your hands, and if you can't change it with your hands, change it with your tongue, and if you can't change it with your tongue, at least hate it in your heart, right? And so there's this element of an ethics of bearing witness that comes back to us being held accountable. If I can just say one thing to that, I find one thing that's a little bit frustrating. So I feel like I'm about to repeat a lot of the conversations we just had like 2 days ago, but I think Islamophobia, we know, encourages these politics of like condemnation. We're seeing that right now, like Muslims can't have a voice unless they condemn, right? It also has very clearly made these politics of respectability. And I recognize that in myself. People hear me, they're like, man, this dude is like American, it's blasphemy, I'm Canadian, but it's fine. Oh, he can speak, he's a psychologist, there's all these degrees of respectability that I'm always constantly like employing. But, right now, even with Gaza, so many people can't seem to only be able to like bear witness or mobilize through their professions, you know? Like, oh, as doctors, we're gonna mobilize as doctors, you know? Or as like teachers will mobilize as teachers. And yeah, I think that brings it back to this idea of how respectability politics is so deeply ingrained, and it speaks to our political climate that we can't just go ahead and say and mobilize as Muslims that this is an essential evil, like this is an essential wrong. The killing of innocents is worse, like the killing of one innocent is worse than the actual destruction of the Kaaba in Mecca, right? Just one. And now we have like over 10,000 Kaabas. So, you know, just having, I think, yeah, that discourse, which I recognize comes from, you know, right now decades of being securitized, right? And not being able to mobilize in ways that are more authentically reflect how we feel, but always have to be almost refracted and I would say almost perverted through institutions as a way of legitimizing ourselves, right? And even 2 days ago, you know, one of the audience members mentioned how we always have like a white person in front of us to like channel our thoughts through. And yes, this white person is saying it, so let's retweet them, right? But not maybe like my local scholar who's speaking like a Muslim scholar or like, you know, a Muslim woman who's speaking from the heart, you know, obviously a Muslim woman can be a Muslim scholar, but just like anybody who's speaking from the heart. And maybe being also quite angry and having that righteous anger. We won't retweet that, but we'll do it through the respectability of whiteness. Yeah, I'm sharing a lot of different thoughts.
No, I think there's so many things I want to pick up there. I mean, two things. So one, the story about your mother, I find that really profound. And I think just thinking about maybe why we struggle to mobilize as Muslim or what that would look like. I kind of see a connection between those 2 points. And for me, it comes back to this thing of not really having the space or perhaps knowing how to access our own modes of knowledge. And what I mean when I say that, I talk about in the book, there's an essay where I kind of talk about how to do that, to say that I am Muslim in the most uncomfortable way, not the most respectable way, is a really disruptive thing. And I talk about the story of after the night journey, which is this moment in Islamic history when the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was taken by an angel on a beast that does not have there's not a physical counterpart for it, to not only Jerusalem from Mecca, but then up into the heavens. And upon returning, one of the kind of members of the community that kind of mocked and made fun and derided the Prophet goes to his closest companion, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and says, you know, do you know that your friend is claiming that he went to Jerusalem last night? You know, like, we're not talking about planes, we're not talking about trains, we're talking about this guy saying he went from Mecca to Jerusalem. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu says, did he say that? So first he clarifies, like, what is the source, right, of the knowledge that's being claimed? Did he say that? Yes. If he said it, then it's true. I find that so profound because to me, that's in a society where it's not strange to believe in God, right? Everyone believes in God. It's like maybe how many you believe in is the issue, right? But even in that context, he is deemed absurd for this commitment to an unseen reality purely based on the person who has said it. Even despite the fact that that very person, the Prophet, was known unanimously by the society that he lived in as truthful, even by those who opposed him. This was his nickname was the truthful one. You know, this was just like a well-known thing. And so the reason I draw on that story in this context is that, do we dare to be that committed to truth? It's like a question I raise for myself, right? Like, knowing how absurd you will be deemed to a secular Western colonial gaze to commit to the unseen. And I think there's something really exciting about exploring that space. And to me, it kind of links to the story of your mother, right? There's something absurd about you're going to go see a boy in a hospital who's asleep. Like, who's that? Why are you doing that? That's a really random thing to do. And likewise, like, for Muslims to be able to mobilize on our own terms, I think requires for us to be okay with being absurd. And there's a often quoted hadith narration about Muslims being strangers, like the positionality of the stranger or strangeness, and it's something I try and like excavate and play with a little bit, that word in my book. But like strangeness, like what if we were okay with it? Because I think so much of respectability and so much of wanting to be that respectable Muslim is, I don't want to be strange. I want you to think I'm just like you. And then in moments like this, moments of like a mass globally endorsed and sanctioned Islamophobia, is when we see it didn't matter. It didn't matter. Like you could, everything, all those acts of assimilation and trying, it's irrelevant. Like those narratives will sanction your murder, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And so I think, to me, that leaves the only real option then is be absurd, be that what would it mean to fully occupy that strange and uncomfortable possibility? But I think that when I think like that, I also know that the only way for that to be read, and there's a chapter in my book where I talk about this. When I think like that, I know the only way for that to be read is threat. The only way for that to be read is, okay, now what you're saying sounds like an extremist. Now you're speaking like somebody who's been compelled by their inner propensity to violence.
I really want to jump on that because you have a really fantastic, commentary. You work so much with different communities, and you can observe the difference between like teaching kids and teaching adults. And you observe, and I feel like I've observed the same thing, that kids have this amazing imagination. They have this fantastic imagination. They can imagine a different world very easily. Whereas adults are just like constantly going for like I don't know how you phrased it, but like lowest common denominator. Yeah, the least worst. Like
no trash.
Yeah, like the least worst is like, yeah, exactly. Like the no trash. No trash is a really, really good example. And I find that really powerful because I think that idea of the absurd is also linked to our capacity to imagine. I mean, if we think right now also what we're seeing in social media, just this idea of ceasefire, okay? So now we're seeing ceasefire come up as like the main sort of construct that good people should at least be pushing for. And, okay, yes, obviously, ceasefire, like that would have been the most obvious answer, but where is the imagination beyond decades and decades, 100 years of settler colonial occupation? What can you imagine a future that where people can thrive? All people can thrive. Can you even imagine what that would look like? And as you're saying, right, like immediately this idea of like, let's say let's pretend it's not coming from me, but like a post-Zionist world is immediately this idea that's incredibly threatening, even though, many Israelis, many Jews, many people are constantly having this conversation, and even for me to say that is a way of self-protection. I find is really powerful, this lack of imagination, and people may ascribe it to strategy. Everything always comes back to strategy, realpolitik as they call it, right? Like, what can we effectively accomplish? What are the small incremental changes that we can make? Fine, okay, strategy, incremental changes, but it's the very imagination that's we're totally devoid of people being able to imagine like a different future. And I think I actually had one idea to that. I mean, I'll also mention just one thing, and maybe also to sort of acknowledge the maybe experience of suffocation that many people have here, and myself talking about Palestine and Gaza. I mean, we have to be very clear here that there's immaterial ways in which we are managed to talk about Palestine as racialized Muslims, and that self-censorship comes down to like how I'm going to be identified. But there's also material ways, right? Like I think it's important to mention that like counterterrorism law is enshrined, or I mean, in a way that, you know, the resistance movement, it's itself a prescribed organization. So now anything I say or do that somehow even remotely comes close to supporting in any way, shape, or form a prescribed organization is itself illegal, right? Like that's a very material way in which like the police can come to me and be like, hey, did you say something that somehow supports them? I mean, I think we have many different, we have different challenges that underline our ability to, I think, speak from the heart. Yeah, you have something?
No, I think on that point of imagination as well, something that I guess I'm thinking about the arts in particular because that is a space that's supposed to be a space where you can imagine. Like it's supposed to be creativity and expression. And something I've often thought about is how I feel like, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you'll have an interesting comment on this, like with your critique of trauma as a lens, but I feel like oftentimes we are either having to explore, rectify narrations of the past and history, or we're dealing with like the violence of the present, and it leaves very little space or time to imagine ourselves forwardly. And I think that is something that is like really evident, and it feels like this burden to, you're always one step behind, right? It's like always just reacting to the wrong that's just happened. And, you know, like, yeah, I think even the point about ceasefire, it's kind of one step behind, right? It's like, stop genocide, that's like, duh, you know, like what's the next thing? And so, yeah, I think there's something really, I think it immobilizes and kind of paralyzes us because there's all of this violence to kind of acknowledge. You know, it's not even been acknowledged. So, like in the first place, I feel like we are prevented from even knowing what comes next because we haven't even accounted for what has come, what has happened. And I feel really aware of, in the art space, you know, if someone asks the question, which is a really simple question of like, what would you like to make? It doesn't feel like the freedom to imagine doesn't feel like it's there. It feels like there's such a responsibility with that as, you know, maybe racialized people in general or marginalized people in different ways. And so I think there's also something about when do we get to imagine and with whom do we want to imagine? And so I think there's maybe something about the reason that it's children that can do that is that there is a kind of innocence/ignorance that I think comes with a lack of knowledge, which is almost maybe necessary for being able to imagine. And I'm not saying that in a jaded way. It's just a kind of, I'm just thinking aloud, and perhaps I'll disagree with myself in a moment. But yeah, one of the things that excites me though about, again, bringing it to like what an Islamic imagining could offer. I'm sure a lot of people might have seen, it's been going around the internet, that the Dua al-Nasiri, and it's a dua that apparently was written during the time of the French occupation of Morocco, a prayer that was written and recited very widely, like across, you know, mosques throughout Morocco, and such that the French eventually banned this prayer. And I find that just a really interesting and instructive thing to think about, because what does it mean for a power to ban something it does not even believe in the reality of? I find that really intriguing because it kind of suggests that there is a knowledge that there is some sort of mobilization, some sort of power, some sort of hope being inculcated, even whilst we want to pretend that we do not see or acknowledge that thing. And likewise, I remember one of the most inspiring things I learned when I was writing my previous book was that the very first rebellions by enslaved people in the Americas were by Muslim West Africans who very often, you know, fought against their oppressors and the slavers because they were compelled to by their religious beliefs. And so this was to the extent that Charles V of Spain actually passed an edict saying that we should avoid enslaving Muslims from West Africa because they're seen as too rebellious, they're too problematic. And so there's probably an interesting analysis to do there about the relationship between perceptions of rebellion, etc. But the more interesting point to me was that there's like a knowledge that these people believe in something that we don't even want to contend with, that must be so I guess I'm just interested in what does it mean for something to not be seen and also be known to be powerful? And I guess the inverse is also true, just thinking about the awful humiliation of, for example, Muslim men, whether it's what we've seen in the West Bank lately, or whether it's thinking of Abu Ghraib and the pictures that came out of there, there's a deliberate, intentional, epistemological violence that you're knowingly enacting, but whilst you also deny the reality of those people's belief system as even having a reality. And I hope I'm not overcomplicating the point I'm trying to make, but I guess I'm just raising a question of, what if we really believe there was power in that? Because I feel like we kind of feel like, I think we also accept that the religious element is secondary, that it's kind of like that our own metaphysics are an add-on or an additional element. And so I'm just interested in what it would look like, and it's a question to myself, I guess, first and foremost, but what it would look like to treat it with almost the same seriousness that those that seek to police it treat it with. But again, then you enter the dimension of just being threat, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic question. And I think by nature of the fact that it is being policed in such a way prevents us from even imagining it, right? I think that's it, right? It's a vicious circle. The possibility of imagining it. I mean, also, I think it brings it back to Palestine. There's these discussions, sometimes underhanded, sometimes explicit. Is Palestine a Muslim issue? Or is it a human rights issue, right? And I think the most palpable and legible way is to make it a human rights issue. Because the moment you make it a Muslim issue, well, now you're falling into the category of all the different sort of archetypes that are associated with Muslimness and violence and threat, and I think there's a lot there that we've been contending with, I think, for a long time, and I think it's part of that history as well. I mean, I think hopefully most people in this room understand that there's a very long history to the occupation, but there's also a really long history to Muslims being associated with threat in all these colonial projects, right? And having to manage Muslim consciousness in such a way. And maybe just to end it on maybe one final thought, when you were talking about France's occupation of North Africa, actually one of the most, I forgot who, I'm trying to remember who wrote about this. It might be Wa'il Halaq, but I'm trying to remember, but forget about the name. I'm just gonna go ahead and share the idea. He was saying one of the first things, or one of the most powerful things that the French occupation did to North Africa was destroy the waqf system, right? And the waqf system, for people who don't know, is a ethically based trust system that was established, that's always been long established within Islamic civilizations, that if you have a well or something, that this would be a waqf that belongs to the people, right? So the moment you establish this as a waqf, no one can take ownership of this. It's something that has to be maintained. It's something that suddenly is open, it has its purpose, and it's set out that way, right? And everything can be a waqf, right? So across history, hospitals, things like that were waqf, and there wasn't, when I say it's an ethically based system, the whole framework around it was inherently, it couldn't have been anything but religious, right? So it had to be Islamic in the sense that people were doing this with, there's no profiteering. It runs contrary to any sort of capitalist, essentialization to value, right? Because you actually don't get any value out of it. The value comes from a spiritual framework that gives you that value also when you die, right? So that's what comes out of the waqf as well. And as people have written about waqf, the waqf system is something that inherently ties people together. Like it's like this social glue that makes communities rather than networks of individuals, people who kind of know each other because we all just go to school here, we all just met here, like people are dependent on things that people have invested in, and there's history, we know where all these benefits and things are coming from. So I might be overcomplicating it, but the whole point is that the reason why France destroyed it is because it destroyed these essential glues that bring people together, right? Like even just even before language, like it's pre-linguistic. It's this idea that forget about me, not me, because we could still meet, but the social glue, like the fabric by which we feel like we can fall, if I fall behind, if I lose my footing, and all the structures around in my own personal life fall apart, but I know inherently I have something I can fall back upon. That's not there. Yeah. I can still see you, but I know in the back of my mind that if these structures disappear, there's nothing left, right? And the waqf system was a way, the moment you diminish that, you actually diminish the social, the social glue. So I'm gonna go ahead. Are you okay if we just take a short break? Yeah? So I think what we'll do is, we'll take like a 12-minute break, come back at 3:30, and maybe we can then also just open it up to the audience. Okay, cool. Maybe just to start us off, I wanted to actually just share one thing. Is that okay? And then you can respond or share another thing, and we could just take it. So it's very unscripted, but I feel like there was something I really wanted to share about, I guess, the experience of Islamophobia, and I think it kind of links to Gaza. It's just the idea of suffering and whose violence gets legitimized. And I feel like, I missed an opportunity to maybe talk about, I talk about it in my book. So if you read my book, I have a chapter called The Politics of Muslim Mental Health. And I talk about how, our institutions will recognize if, let's say, a Muslim woman or a Muslim man gets attacked on the street, let's say gets her hijab ripped off or something, something terribly violent. I was attacked on the street before, so I can speak to that. And in essence then, and we can even think that on a much worse scale, we think about the attacks that happen on mosques, like Christchurch, like the Quebec City mosque shooting. And there's like this political response that recognizes that that's bad violence. That's violence that shouldn't have happened to you. And we want to make sure that you receive the help that you deserve after that sort of violence. It's the sort of violence that the police obviously appreciate. And kind of the police is a really good barometer in defining which violence is legitimate and which violence is not legitimate. And I wanted to put that side by side with another case of a Muslim mother whose family member might have been accused of extremism. And suddenly all state institutions fall upon her, schools, social services, everyone, to take her child away from her because she's somehow in the perimeter of extremism. And I speak with mothers like that, and the absolute suffocation that they experience in the face of that. I've spoken to mothers who they're shaking, they're literally shaking, they're also hypersensitive. It's a sort of thing that maybe if you have any idea of the word trauma, you'd associate with that. But it's visceral, and it's completely ignored and dismissed because it's understood through the state structures that violence is legitimate. And we see that same thing happening with Gaza, this idea of how psychology somehow, will have these trauma response teams for certain forms of violence. But this mother it's not only seen and dismissed by the state structures, it's largely even dismissed within the Muslim community itself, right? And I think that's part of Islamophobia, this idea of like guilt by association. Oh, if there's like this family here that's somehow associated with extremism, or they said something that was wrong, now we all look away from them. We all do that shifting of our gaze. Let's all not bear witness to them. And I think it's from our conversation, I was just thinking, I wanted to like also validate that I think what's happening in Gaza is obviously some of the worst I think any of us have ever seen, but in a way, that violence is something that we see on a global scale because Islamophobia is occurring on a global scale, in which certain people's violence are considered legitimate and they're incredibly suffocating and difficult. And I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I won't say too much. Just one tiny thing it reminded me of what you said is, for my previous book, I interviewed Muazzam Baig, who famously was detained in Guantanamo Bay. But one of the things he said to me, which always stuck with me, was that the prevent policy and its likes is the Guantanamoization of society. And I think it kind of links to what you're saying in the sense that maybe we recognize, or some people recognize, extremities of violence when they take certain forms. But once those have become normalized and embedded in the culture of just like, this is just how certain people must be treated. The example he gave was that at Guantanamo, I think it was Guantanamo, that they were asked, maybe that he was talking about Kandahar actually at one point, that people were asked about, did you associate with such and such person? And how often did they pray? And he was like, that association of piety and threat is now, that's just normal. That would be, there's so many prevent stories of, does your father read the Quran to you? Like, do you have this at home? That's, so, yeah, sorry, I took it in a slightly different direction, but it just reminded me of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. I think that speaks also to our way of self-censoring ourselves. Our Islam, when we're talking about that sort of artificial division between our Muslimness, being a Muslim at the table, but not bringing Islam to the table, we can see how that plays out. I mean, we know for a fact that piety has been securitized, and I think that relates it back to the idea of like the dua or the prayer being like securitized, right? Like, I think it speaks a lot to this. Should we open up to the audience in case they want to join in the conversation? So would anyone like to share any thoughts, reflections on the conversation so far, or anything else they'd like to bring? Oh, we never spoke about the sale of the book. I guess we can mention that very quickly. So you can raise your hand and a microphone will come to you, but I think we'll just mention that the books, because we keep getting asked questions about the books, so the books will be sold when we're done. And also they're available online as well, so. Just for the sake of the audience also, please speak into the microphone.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very... Is this working? Okay. Thank you both very much for everything today. My name is Mariam. I just had a question about future generation. You've talked about children. And I wondered how we've gotten to a place where for many Muslims in the UK and the West, we've reached a state of faith and security where we're operating with the secular gaze that you've both discussed. I think the worrying thing for me is often in Muslim spaces. I think it's understandable at times, especially because Muslims are often in poverty in the UK, to protect jobs, to protect the jobs that are associated with respectability. But I'm particularly increasingly worried about Muslim spaces that I find myself in, and you've both alluded to this, where that secular gaze is often at the forefront. And I do think it's very linked to faith insecurity. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how we ensure going forward that does not happen to the future generation of young Muslims, both in the West and in Muslim countries. Thank you.
How do we ensure that doesn't happen? Good question. I don't think I can answer that question, but something I have noticed that it's just an observation, and it could be false. I feel that when I engage with younger Muslims, I feel like they are not faced with this same and maybe it's just a different manifestation of it, but I think that, because I think maybe the generation that I'm of, I feel like it's a twofold thing. There's the securitization that's crept up over the years, but then I think there's also prior to that a kind of assimilationist drive to do with safety, security, all those things you mentioned. And maybe there's other factors that play in terms of like estrangement from religious knowledge itself as well. And I don't know, these are very much my speculations and anecdotal reflections on my own life, but I kind of feel like because of securitization, I think a lot of young Muslims are actually really hyper aware of their religion. And I also think, and this is just my own experience again, but in thinking about like my own loved ones and close ones, I do believe that as Islam became securitized, I think people felt a responsibility to know what Islam was, or to some degree. At least I remember myself when I began wearing my scarf, I felt I needed to have a really good justification, which is of course horrific, but I felt that I did. And so that then led me to kind of pursue maybe an interest in Islam that I didn't actually necessarily organically have, which is fascinating. So yeah, I don't know, my instinct is, you know, they plan and Allah plans, and who knows, like there's a way in which securitization has also maybe led to a firmness of kind of something. I don't know, I just say, like, when I see kids in schools, I'm really astounded sometimes by, like, subhanAllah, their outspokenness and their, you know, I've heard of sixth form students being banned from praying, and they pray in congregational prayer nevertheless, and things like that, where I'm just like, that would never have happened in my time. So yeah, sorry, it's not an immediate answer, but it's an observation.
Yeah. I don't know, I think I have hope. I see hope. I see on two levels. I think one, individual, you know, like when my mom took me to the hospital, you know, she's not like, oh, let me like strategize the like future of the ummah, you know, like she's not, my mom isn't thinking about that. My mom is doing something that comes, I think, very natural to people who are concerned with the welfare of others, to teach our children what the reality of the world is. And I feel it's something I'm doing with my children. I feel it's something that we know parents are doing. We know parents are doing it, so much so we know the Department of Education is mentioning it about what's happening with Palestine. You know, there's a Zionist outfit called Solution Not Sides. Solutions Not Sides. And they are deployed in British schools to, you know, balance the conversation on Palestine. And we know they're getting a lot more funding right now. The only reason they're getting a lot more funding is because obviously there's a reality on the ground that parents and the community are not like going to turn away from what's happening. You know, like I think on a personal level, I think that's just one point. But I think on another point, for someone, at least speaking for myself, I'm not that old, but I've had, I don't know what old is. I'm not gonna even say my age now that I made it awkward. But you know, I have a good number of years of mobilizing and working with the Muslim community. And as you said, you know, there's things about, even around Palestine that in protests, you know, the whole thing about from the river to the sea. I remember like 15 years ago, people weren't saying that out loud. You know, I think there's things, I mean, that's very anecdotal. I feel there's a shift. I feel that shift not only in public consciousness, I also feel the shift in how I think 20 years of the war on terror, we're mobilizing differently now. You know, we are that whole, you know, those long-standing discussions of like integration, assimilation, has gone. Now it's truly about justice. And you see all these justice-centric movements and mobilizations and organizations, not only here, even in countries like, I'm saying like Denmark and other places that really never had a history of that. And the solidarity movements that we're building across spectrums, right? Like I think it's also recognizing that people building and making those relationships between the war on terror and gangs, knives, how the logics of racism operate and how we're racialized as threat, you know, and the intersectional elements of that. we know this much more. We're mobilizing on this much more. I think I'm not necessarily concerned for the future. I'm concerned for not playing a part of it. You know, like I'm concerned for myself. I think that's my way of saying it. But yeah, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I guess, I was just thinking also while you were speaking when it comes to the young generation, this idea of compartmentalization of identity. You talk about bringing your Muslims versus your Islam. And I kept thinking throughout, they will be able to understand that we view the world in a not so limited form because we believe in Allah, we believe in His only power, we believe in His omnipresence, etc. So I guess, yeah, I'm glad that you brought in some optimism, and I hope that we continue for ourselves and for each generation to remind them of the difference in our worldview to the worldview in a secular society that wants to enforce that on us. I think limits our capabilities. But yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Found this conversation really, really interesting and insightful. I'm really interested in this. We've touched upon the psychology and the way that the language of psychology is used against us, and almost so subtly that it's very easy for us to miss. What can we do in order to remind ourselves about this? Because so much of the way we like, as you said, we're self-censoring ourselves, sometimes even before we notice it. And now you've all mentioned examples, and now I'm thinking back to all of my examples that I have, and the way that I was writing a post about Islamophobia Awareness Month, November, to share with my workplace, and I made sure I put it on my personal account and not my work account, because I was like, I don't know what the consequences would be for it to be on my work, all of these things that you're kind of doing self-consciously. And I'm really interested in hearing about like what should we be reminding ourselves in terms of when we are faced with just the everyday in our workplaces, the everyday when you go to the shops and see the headlines, the everyday, that kind of thing, about countering that kind of that language and that psychology.
Yeah, I think that might be the golden question. I think it's a constant struggle. I see two elements of your question, one about the psychology and how to counter that. That's one thing I'm sort of mobilizing on. I recognize that the language of psychology, language of mental health especially, is something that the Muslim community felt like it was lacking, and so there's a lot of movement and trying to support it, and stigma, reduction or fighting or whatever. I think my way of framing it is that we need to always politicize everything we're doing. Nothing exists within this apolitical vacuum. And the example I give is Grenfell, actually. When the Grenfell atrocity, when the murders happened of Grenfell, it actually had one of the largest mental health responses in European history. Yeah, I think it was like over 1,500 people were seen for trauma, which is really important to hold on to the fact that there's been absolutely no justice or accountability following Grenfell, right? And there's something about what mental health as a language is able to elicit as something that's being done that it's hyper-individualizing, it's making it about the individual's experience. And that's why I generally, even as a psychologist, people don't know I'm a psychologist often when I'm talking, but as a psychologist, I'm mindful, I'm very careful for myself to not talk about mental health, because especially around Islamophobia, because I'm very mindful that impulse, that it's going to be, how do we address the anxiety, the depression, and all these things that come from Islamophobia? No. That impulse, we gotta push back against it. Accountability, justice, right? So one way that I think is, that as a piece of advice, just from my own experience, is that we always try to center justice in our language first, never to dismiss people's experiences. We always have to center people's experiences, but in the centering of people's experiences, they'll often say justice is what we need first and foremost. That's actually what people in Palestine and Gaza are saying as well, right? They were saying we don't need your aid, right? That what they need is our, they also say our prayer and things like that, but there's things we have to do to ensure that justice first and foremost comes to them. And so I think there's that element, but also then I think on a day-to-day, I mean, part of this space is also appreciating that suffocation. I'm sure for all racialized Muslims here, but in a way, Palestine makes everybody a Muslim if you speak for it. Like I think everyone has this experience of anxiety, of speaking, of being Muslim, and how we conduct ourselves. The small piece of advice I can say to that is really the most like age-old tradition is that technically we should always be mobilizing as a collective, always. Like it's this idea that we think that, we can speak out by ourselves, that's how we move. I think for anyone who feels anxious, like this is where we have to mobilize and we come together, we speak collectively. That's why we're all gonna be, inshallah, at the protest, November 11th, right? We all do these local actions, we speak together. That's true power, right? And I think that's where things make a difference.
I don't think I have much to add to that. I just separately, I guess, not separately, but maybe a mulling of my own recently. And this comes, I guess I should caveat it with, I'm self-employed, like I think there's a certain freedom with that. But I think whenever some member of my family maybe expresses some concern or worry, etc., one thing I do, and I do believe this, is that if we look at the past few decades, those things that we believe protect us, they haven't. And so I kind of also take the opinion that whether you speak or you don't speak, you're still gonna end up in the same position. And so, I don't know, I think I think the place I am now is that it's not about whether you have the flag or not have the flag. It's not about whether you say Free Palestine or not Free Palestine. It's something else, and that's really we'll all be in that together. And I think it's therefore it would have been a shame to not have said anything. So I think that's the way I see it, and I think history tells that tale too.
I just really want to affirm that, just in terms of my personal soul, as a psychologist, I work almost exclusively with people who've experienced state violence, police violence, in any way, like Islamophobia in all its forms. I promise you, it's something that keeps coming back. We can play condemnation politics all we want, respectability politics. It does not protect us. It absolutely does not protect you. It actually not only does not protect you, and that's the worst part of it, it also throws the next person under the bus who doesn't want to play it. So for us to play respectability and be like, I'm the psychologist, like if I go and I'll stop that border police, and I mentioned that in a different story, and I'll be like, hey, like I'm respectable. And they'll be like, fine, okay, go through, you're a respectable Muslim. I just threw the next Muslim under the bus who doesn't have a PhD, right? Who might even have a troubled history, and that was completely beyond him. Like, I think it's not only about how these things don't protect us, it's about how it hurts us collectively when we play these roles, and I find that such an important reminder that inevitably, I'm not saying then just say whatever you want, right? Like we have to, the whole point is about strategizing, being smart, and recognizing the power comes collectively. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to jump on.
No, I like that. That's also reminded me of the final thing, which is just, I don't know, sometimes I think the most inspiring things that I've seen said by Palestinians on the ground is, it always comes back to their trust in Allah, and it's that thing of, to an immensity and a level that I cannot imagine, but if we truly and really believe that our risk is written here, it's already, then there's nothing to lose. There is nothing to lose, which I know it's easy to say that and it's different to act upon that, but I also feel like that's the possibility that we're talking about earlier. Like if we really leant into that, I feel like that's exciting and that's terrifying, I think, to the institutions, to the states, to the status quo, because I saw, I think, someone in Gaza saying that, something about there's nothing more terrifying than a people who do not fear death. And that's the possibility I'm talking about. Like, I can see how that's terrifying, and I can see how that's also like super cool. Like, I love that. I'm like, Muslims are cool. But yeah, again, it's another way to talk about that as well.
Hi. I think I'm speaking into it now. It's amazing to hear you guys speak, firstly. So you've been speaking a lot about respectability politics, and I'm just wondering, I feel like a lot of the time you'll be in spaces in a secular society, in a Western society, where you are in these positions where there is racialization, and I guess to say it is hard to say sometimes, but there is racism and Islamophobia. But as you've also said, when you do speak out, the response is typically personal, sort of like about your emotions, which, as you say, it's not to do with at all. And also there are quite a few times there'll be token Muslims or other ethnic minorities who will sort of be the face of allowing them to say that. And in those sorts of situations, you speak out and nothing really happens. And to be honest, it can be very easy, and also potentially it can seem like the right thing to do, to have spoken out and then just sort of let the rest happen organically, because maybe you've said enough that something will change for you, but as you rightly say, that doesn't necessarily mean it will change for the next person. They will still have to do the speaking out, and it may be someone who doesn't want to speak out at all. So I guess, what would you suggest when you're in that position?
I don't know if I fully understood that.
I think there's a premise implicit in your question about how, in a way, we all kind of have to speak out at different times. But I think, in a way, the premise of how I think systems of injustice make us feel that way, that we kind of, it's on us to like make an action, or act in a way that resists in a way what's happening to us, right? And I think that speaks to actually the issue in the system itself, that you feel like, oh, what can I do but to speak out right now? And I don't even know if that's gonna work. The moment that's the premise, the flaw is in the system, right? The system itself is not able to understand, recognize, validate, and mobilize on the injustice that you're experiencing, right? So you're shouldering the flaw in the system. And now I think that's what we all feel in all our fields. We're all feeling constantly that shoulder of responsibility of, okay, what do I do now? Should I speak out? Should I not speak out? We're constantly strategizing for ourselves because there's no, first of all, the system itself might not recognize that what's happening towards us is violent, right? For example, a prevent referral. It might not recognize that if a teacher does a prevent referral towards my child, that I would find that the most unjust thing in the world. And I feel like that was a terrible violence, and it won't recognize that. So that's already a flaw in the system, and now I'm trying to carry that responsibility. I'm carrying the weight of that and trying to say, okay, how do I mobilize on this? I think there's a part of just recognizing, first of all, if we're feeling this way, the problem is in the system, right? The problem is in the institution itself, of how it's not like facilitating our ability to seek that justice, to seek accountability, that there's no processes in place for us to do that. And so does that make sense? Does that sort of answer your question? That doesn't help us, obviously. It doesn't help you. It doesn't help me. Because it's like, okay, Tarek, well, if the flaws in the system, then great, thank you. And now go ahead and keep dreaming of a better world. I work at a university, right? I've worked in public health. I'm well aware this is what I do. You know, I'm well aware what I'm constantly self-censoring at the university, constantly, right? But I think in my heart, I also recognize, maybe just with rehearsal, which is part of rehearsing freedoms, I come to recognize that if I'm feeling this way, there's a problem here. It's in this institution. Then obviously I have to start making choices with my life. Is this something that I can mobilize on? How do I strategically move forward with the fact that this is happening, that the prevent policies at my university, you know, things like that. Like, how do I move forward, right? But I think for myself, I can't allow myself to fall into a hole of, I'm alone in this, and I'm carrying this by myself, this burden. And the next person is going to carry this burden on their own. The next lecturer at this university is also going to be carrying this on their own. If we all feel that way, we're done. We're done, I think. And I think that's where we have to learn to mobilize. And that's why often at the end of events, I always mention that we should be seeking out these different organizations. There's actually a lot of organizations that support us, a lot. If you're in NHS, there's MedAct, there's other health-based organizations. If you're in schools, there's also unions. Like, there's so many, right? Like, there's so many that exist. So I think it's about finding the people, finding the spaces we can turn to, seeing what's been done, joining the greater strategy. And every person's experience is valuable. Every single person's experience is valuable. I mean, I personally, obviously there's more to be said on that, but I think it's important to recognize the value of our experiences. I think we often just we're so dismissive of our own suffocation, our anxiety. Oh, I'm suffocating at this meeting. We've normalized it as this is just what it is. No, this is incredibly valuable. Everybody has a story. We have how many tens, hundreds of thousands of stories that are incredibly powerful. I just quickly mention, I think there was 2 people who raised their hand in the front too, but I don't know what the order was. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your words. I just had a quick question. I'm not sure how to think about it, but you guys have given us a clearer understanding of the prevent and that being a political project, using the language of psychology and instrumentalizing our feelings against us and things like that, and the state doing that. But how do you understand that when we have a very fascist government which is taking a really hardline stance on any kind of political resistance to their terms, anything? I mean, even the most milquetoast liberal resistance is a problem. Do you understand this as a coherent political project, utilizing both those things? Do you think they're different? How do you see us really mobilizing against both those things? Yeah.
So just to check, was the both the prevent? What was the both? Just to clarify.
Using that language, you've said, the Department of Education using prevent, or those longer term political projects which we're really familiar with under the war, the on terror, and all these things have been happening for decades, but what we're living under now as well.
Okay. I mean, just one thing that comes to mind, I don't know if it's helpful, but I found it really helpful, and I'm sure you'll be familiar, but in case anyone isn't, I think Aaron Kodnani makes this point that there's a view that we'll all agree is racist, which is, all Muslims are terrorists, or, they all need to be surveilled. And then there's the other view, which is, no, it's just a few with a warped interpretation, and we kind of need to, there are signs and all of this kind of science, but the outcome is the same, right? That actually any Muslim could be violent, therefore they all need surveilling. And so I guess my instinct in terms of the question is, the political project is coherent, I would say, in that sense, in the sense that it's a colonial, I think this moment, if it's showing anything, is that we're still in a colonial moment. This is not I think the face of things and the guise and the language may look different, but actually even that is in a long trajectory of liberal language, the language of democracy, of secularism, of Western rights discourses and universality that is also decades old. So I guess something I think about and have been thinking about the last few years is like, I feel like the anti-racism of the kind of 1970s, 80s, there was a lot more conversation around anti-imperialism. And I think that, I don't think it's an accident that the kind of anti-racism we talk about today, or institutions tell us to talk about today, really lacks that. Because I think when we make that connection, then the political project does feel very coherent. It's like, oh, this is just capitalism. This is just, the oppression is sanctioned and very necessary for the operation of things to continue. And the question I often ask when I'm confused about kind of how does this all make sense is who benefits? And I think that was the kind of pursuit of my book about Islamophobia. I kind of went into, to be honest, quite open-minded in the sense that I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'll find. And I think it was undeniable by the end that, there are very clear beneficiaries of Islamophobia. And those beneficiaries almost always is that money is being made to produce narratives that also sanction, uphold money-making schemes, for example, whether that's geopolitical, whether that's oil, or whether it's financial in other ways. And I think that, again, helps to make it coherent, because I think we are just diverted by the language that can send us in all these different directions. And then, it's like Toni Morrison says, that then you spend 20 years proving that, oh, no, we do have a history, and 20 years proving, oh, no, our heads are the same size. But actually, the whole project was the same the whole time. So maybe that's reductive, but I think the way I see it is that. And then when we see it like that, I think it helps us to be more strategic, because we can target the root causes. And I think, that's something that is very present in Tarek's work, and I think in my own as well, that the root causes are the thing that are just consistently just left to slide. There is no accountability, there is no attention to them. And I think like moments like now, what we see is like this real clarity that the root causes have never been addressed. They weren't even barely touched or scratched at. So yeah, I don't know. For me, that's where I find some clarity. I don't know if that helps.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that was fantastic. I just want to say, after 20 years of war on terror right now, I just want to say that we have all indications Islamophobia is getting worse. All indications, 100%. The prevent policy, they're going to introduce something called ideological training, right? They're making it very clear that it's about Islam, about being able to teach people what bad Islam is. But after 20 years of war on terror, we also have a lot more structures, a lot more understanding of what's going on, what's happening, right? So when we bring in questions of like, oh, prevent, counterterrorism, security, racialization, we know this, like, and we've developed, there's so much mobilization. So I think there's something about holding on to the movement that's happening as a source of hope as well. I'm mindful we might only have time, so I just wanted to be, I'm the timekeeper here, and I know it's 4:08, it's on purpose. I'm very good generally at timekeeping. I just want to point that out, and I think other people on the team can confirm that. The reason why I'm going above and beyond is because I know on the ticket, it was from 2 to 5, okay? I just forgot to mention, there's a bunch of things I realized I forgot to mention, that we were planning today to go from like 2 to 4, but I'm mindful that if maybe there's one more question, we can go like to 4:15. Is everyone okay with that? But also if anyone wants to leave, then we can then start also clearing up this. Oh, we don't have to clear up the space today, so that's fine. But yeah, so if there was any more questions, I think, I don't know if there was questions in the front, I think as well. I'm not so sure you can see them, so I'll just point that out. Okay, there you go.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks so much for bringing up the unseen today. It really got me thinking that as a kid, just seeing a lot of solidarity for Bosnia, and that there was no publicity or anything around that. And so I really wanted to ask both of you, what do you think the possibilities are in terms of like political mobilization in terms of the unseen? Because sometimes it helps if people don't know what we're doing, right?
Sorry, so your question is political mobilization on the unseen?
I just feel like it's hard to answer that with cameras.
All of a sudden, huh, Suhaiymah? This is the question. We have to edit out so many other things.
I think that's been a long. There's two things. I think one is strategically being unseen. I think has long been a thing, right? And I think we see that even, we see that now. Okay. I'm just trying to think about what I'm saying. And the other thing is, but in terms of the unseen, in terms of the unseen Islamically, the ghaib and like what's, there's a section in my book where I talk about how much of my day is shaped by belief in the unseen. Like I believe right now there's 2 scribing angels on my shoulder, like all sorts of things that are not seen. And so I think that's the question I'm interested in myself, is like, what would it mean to mobilize on grounds of that? And I think actually what frustrates me in a lot of the discourse around mobilizing for Palestine is that the Palestinian people that is their political language. It is the language of Allah. It is the language of, they're calling themselves martyrs. They're not called, you know what I mean? Like there's all of these, the political language is at the same time the language of Allah and the unseen and angels and all of these things. And I find it really interesting that, when, this is not to sound too disparaging, but when, I've been at protests and it's like a Marxist person leading it's just like does not reflect what the Palestinian people are saying or feeling. And I was at a march the other day and somebody was like, the solution is that we need like a socialist Arab, like, I don't know, unity. And I was like, that's just random. That's so random in terms of like what's being called for by the people. But I think it links to this, like, yeah, I think there's something in that. Like if we were to truly account for that. But yeah, I'm rambling on. But I think the question is the question I'm interested in, is the point.
I'll just mention to that, actually, that last point you just said is one of the main unsaid criticisms of Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon, famous Martinique psychiatrist mobilizing against France, is that in a way some of his analysis and writings was not reflecting the actual resistance movements of North Africa against France. But that's something else to be said. I think mobilizing on unseen is also what we're doing here, by the way. I mean, that's what we're trying to hold on to, the suffocation that I think all of us sort of experience. And I think we want to create more spaces like this. I think we need to be holding on to more spaces like this where we feel like we can come together and be like, okay, what is unseen? What is, besides the sort of spiritual, but also like I think on a very sort of personal level, people's experiences, how do we mobilize on them? I think that's what we need to be doing much more, and people have been doing this for so long, right? So we're continuing those traditions.
Can I also do that really quick? I think also divesting from being seen is really important in the sense that so much of how our anti-racism is co-opted is through representational politics. And so I think there's something really powerful in, imagine if every single one of us was just to say, I boycott being seen, like you will not, I refuse to be represented. I think that would send the EDI structures just like crumbling to their feet because they rely on us wanting to be represented. And if we were to divest from that kind of pursuit, I think it would be really powerful.
Let me jump on that because you actually, maybe we might have to finalize on this comment, so I apologize for doing that. But I think it comes back to your book. And actually I find it such a beautiful reminder that you talk about how the significance of being unseen, but also on a personal level, it also comes from within Islamic traditions to do good where no one sees you but Allah. It's a very particular form of practice of purification for your heart, right? To actually do things that no one else in the world can bear witness to you save for that thing that you're doing. And I think that is absolutely one of the ways that also for ourselves we practice in the unseen. And it's a reminder, I find that's why it's such a great reminder because it's true, we mobilize so much on how do we be seen? Like I'm feeling uncomfortable, how can I be seen in my discomfort? How can I be seen? How can this woman whose children, is threatened to have her children removed, how can she be seen? So we're constantly working towards sight, but like the significance of the unseen is so underplayed. I find it such a good reminder, I think, for all of us, even for Gaza, to think about how do I mobilize for myself in the unseen in a way that I feel like, you know, no one else can see what I'm doing, but this is something I'm doing for them. And on that note, I really just want to thank Suhaiymah for coming down. I'm deeply appreciative of having the space. It was really unscripted, by the way. I mean, I don't even know if we covered like, I don't think we covered like 90% of the themes we thought we would talk about, so that's okay. But yeah, can we just please give Suhaiymah a particular
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk about seen and unseen.
Making me feel seen, yeah. No, thank you, Tarek, for inviting me. And I just wanted to thank the interpreters as well for keeping up with our...
Yes. The interpreters and everybody else in the HDL space, right? So this space has been hosted, curated as well, the walls, everything, HDL, everyone who's been very supportive of helping facilitate these spaces. We still have one more week of events. You can check that out at the door, at the table. There's a program. I won't be hosting anymore, but all the events I've been attending have been really fantastic. Housing justice, health justice, anything that you're interested in. And also, if you have any thoughts of what sort of events HDL can help support, let us know. We'd be very interested in hearing that. On that note, yeah, we have to start clearing up the space, so you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So please, as soon as you're done, maybe we can hold, how should I say this? We keep maybe the smaller conversations here, but we'll have the larger conversations elsewhere. Yeah.
People come and get the books up here.
Oh yeah, books. So we could do books right now. If anybody wants to purchase a book, maybe can we prioritize that? So before talking, if you want to buy a book, let's take care of that right away, and then we can clear up the space. Thank you very much for coming.